Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer, thanks to Vivid Plasma for this one. Amy takes her first turn of the game, and plays a land, Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and passes the turn. On Nick's first turn, he plays Isolated Chapel. Does Isolated Chapel enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Alright, so this is a really interesting question. Obviously, if Nick had another land, any other land, in play, then the Isolated Chapel would enter the battlefield untapped. However, if Nick doesn't control any other lands, well, things get a little bit more interesting. To see why someone might even think that this situation would work, we're going to need to know a little bit about how replacement effects work. Specifically, replacement effects that apply when something is entering the battlefield, which are governed by this rule here. Oh my goodness, that is a lot of text. I'm going to try and help us out by distilling it down and only putting in the stuff that's going to be relevant to our example. So it should maybe look like this. Okay, so that's better, but it still didn't get magically a lot easier to understand. So I'm going to carefully go through all of this stuff and talk about how it explains what we're going to be doing. So replacement effects that modify how something is entering the battlefield do apply when something is entering the battlefield, and they can come from the permanent that is entering the battlefield itself. So in order to see what replacement effects apply and how they apply, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield. And when we do that, we're allowed to take into account any continuous effects that already exist and would apply to that permanent. So applied to this case, we know that Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth has a continuous effect that will apply to Isolated Chapel when Isolated Chapel is on the battlefield. It's going to make the Isolated Chapel into a swamp. So taking all that into account, it sure does kind of look like the Isolated Chapel would enter the battlefield untapped, because we can take a look at how the Isolated Chapel would look when it's on the battlefield and it's a swamp. So that does make some sense. However, there's one little thing that's going to trip us up here, and it's going to ruin everything for us. You see, replacement effects apply immediately before the event that they're replacing. And so that means that this replacement effect is going to apply immediately before Isolated Chapel enters the battlefield. That means that Isolated Chapel is not yet on the battlefield. Even though we can see what it would look like when it's on the battlefield, it actually physically isn't there yet. And so because of that, Nick actually does not control any swamps, and the Isolated Chapel is going to enter the battlefield tapped. Okay, so that was a pretty tricky and kind of subtle point. You can kind of think of it this way though. If the game needs to know some information about the permanent that is entering the battlefield, then when it looks for that information, it's going to imagine how that permanent is going to appear when it is on the battlefield, even though it's not there yet. On the other hand, if the game needs to know some information about the game state, then the game doesn't do any of that imagining stuff. It just takes a look at what the actual game state is at the time that replacement effect is being applied, which, remember, is immediately before the thing that's entering the battlefield gets to be on the battlefield. Alright, so with that being the case, let's take a look at another example that works a little bit differently. Let's say instead of the Urborg, Amy is going to have a Blood Moon, and Nick is still going to be playing the Isolated Chapel. Will the Isolated Chapel enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Now, I actually did a video about this entire situation. However, I'm going to put it in here too because it just fits so well. So let's take a look at exactly what's going to happen. We know that there's going to be a replacement effect with the Isolated Chapel that might affect how the Isolated Chapel enters the battlefield. And so just like before, we're going to take a look and see what replacement effects apply and how they apply. Now, when we're doing this, remember, we do get to take into account how the Isolated Chapel looks when it's on the battlefield, because we're looking for information about Isolated Chapel specifically. We're looking at whether the Isolated Chapel has any replacement effects that are going to affect how it enters the battlefield. And so, when determining how this replacement effect applies, or whether it applies, we do take into account continuous effects that are already on the battlefield and will apply to the Isolated Chapel. Now, Blood Moon definitely is already on the battlefield, and it definitely will apply to Isolated Chapel. We know that Isolated Chapel will not have any abilities as long as Blood Moon is applying to it. And so that gives us the answer to our question. Because Blood Moon is taking away the ability from Isolated Chapel, there are no replacement effects to apply, because the Blood Moon is taking it away. Okay, so hopefully you can see the difference there. In the isolated chapel plus Urborg example, we were looking for information about the game state to see if Nick controlled any swamps. In the isolated chapel plus blood moon example, we were looking for information about isolated chapel specifically. We needed to know whether isolated chapel had any replacement effects. Of course, in the isolated chapel plus Urborg example, we also had to look to see if isolated chapel had any replacement effects. It just so happened that there were no continuous effects on the board that were going to affect the answer to that question, so I kind of glossed over it in that example. Alright, is everybody ready for a final challenge question to test your understanding? Let's say that Amy has both of these cards, and Nick is going to play just a normal basic island. Does the island enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Go ahead and pause the video if you need a little bit more time to think about it, or rewind to go over some of the concepts that we covered earlier if you want to refresh your memory on how some of this stuff works. Okay, so with this example, we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did before. Does the island come into play tapped or untapped? Well, we can see that there's a replacement effect that might affect the answer to that question that comes from the imposing sovereign. So the imposing sovereign says creatures enter the battlefield tapped if they're played by Amy's opponent, Nick. So is this going to be a creature? And so in order to answer that question, we're going to need some information about the island that's entering the battlefield. Is the island a creature? Because we care about the specific information just about the island, we're going to take a look at how the island will appear when it is on the battlefield. Again, taking into account any continuous effects that might apply to the island when it is on the battlefield. Of course, Nature's Revolt is going to apply to the island at that time. And so that means that the game is going to see that the island is going to be a creature while it's on the battlefield. Accordingly, that means that when the game is trying to decide how imposing sovereign's ability applies, it is going to apply it because the island is going to be a creature when it's on the battlefield. Whew, that was a lot of really dense and high-level rules stuff. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you were able to follow this all the way through. And if you had a little bit of difficulty, and if you have to watch things a couple of times in order to really get stuff to sink in, don't worry about it. This is a really complicated topic, and even really amazing judges sometimes mess stuff like this up from time to time. That being said, hopefully everybody has at least a little bit of an understanding for what the difference is between these kinds of scenarios and what you should be looking for in order to get to the answer. If you have any other questions or comments about this type of thing, definitely put them in the comments below, and I'll try to get through as many of them as I possibly can. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.